In this lesson, we'll be diving into the different settings available for each 3D output. Note that this lesson will require you to have prior experience of other 3D software to fully understand the technical terms used. There are two cases where you may want to skip this lesson. First, if you do not require to export 3D outputs for your submission. Second, if the vendor or client is supplying a 3D export preset, you import the preset and have no need to further edit the settings. If either case applies, you can skip this lesson. We are continuing from the previous lesson with the 3D export window opened in vStitcher. First, let's talk about the generic settings available for all the 3D formats. When exporting 3D, we can select if we want to include the avatar. In the Geometry section, we choose whether to export the garment outside geometry only, or export the geometry of the inside of the garment and the thickness of the pattern pieces. Garment outside is always selected by default. We can also select the scale of the 3D output from this drop-down. Let's move on to the Textures section. This section allows us to define the file format and the resolution of the exported textures. Baked textures, when selected, means all the textures in the garment are baked into a single texture. We can also select the file format for the textures, typically PNG or TIFF. However, for GLTF format, we can select PNG or JPEG. Original Textures, tiled, exports the original texture as they are in vStitcher. Note that the Original Textures option is disabled if the chosen 3D format is GLTF or Enhanced Layer Blending is enabled. In the second case, we use the Original Textures by going to Main Menu, Garment, and disabling Enhanced Layer Blending. With Original Textures selected, an Embed Colors property is available for selection. If enabled, this option embeds the color into the texture image. If disabled, the color is kept separate from the texture image. DPI sets the resolution of the textures exported. The default resolution is 150. The higher the DPI, the higher the resolution quality. The pixels setting is only available if single UV layout for all pieces is enabled. We will revisit this option later. Next is the UV section. Here we select the UV mapping method, which is the 3D modeling process of projecting a 2D image onto a 3D model's surface. Single UV layout per piece creates a single texture image for each pattern piece. If selected, Keep Proportions and Stretched are enabled. Keep Proportions 0 to 1 maintains the image proportions, while filling as much of the display space as possible. Stretched 0 to 1 stretches the image to fill the display space. Tiled Textures is selected by default if Original Textures, Tiled, is selected in the Textures section, otherwise it is disabled. Single UV layout for all pieces creates a single texture image of all pieces grouped together. If selected, Square and Bounding Box are enabled. Square 0 to 1 creates an output in a square and is not constrained by the bounding box of the 2D window. Note that the output layout, however, matches the layout in the 2D window. Bounding Box 2D window creates an output that uses the bounding box of the 2D window. Back to the pixel settings. With single UV layout for all pieces selected, Pixels is now enabled. The default value is derived from the DPI setting. By default, the width and height are dynamically linked. Lastly, the Colorways section. Here we can select the colorways we want to include. Great! Now let's take a look at FBX specific settings. When an FBX format is selected, the FBX settings section is displayed. Here we can select the FBX version and type. These settings should be compatible with a third-party 3D software where we want to import the 3D output. In the Advanced Settings section, we will find the following settings. The first option is to up axis. Select Y or Z. Use material names is selected by default. This adds the name of each pattern piece to the geometry exported in the file. If cleared, material names are not exported. Use pattern pieces names, if selected, adds the name of each pattern piece to the geometry exported in the file. Convert BMP to PNG is disabled by default. And lastly, zip export. This saves the exported 3D object file in a zip format. Next, we will talk about the settings available for GLTF v2 format. With GLTF v2 format selected, we will see the GLTF settings section. The first option is the GLTF type. JSON GLTF is the default selection, but you can also select binary, GLB, which contains the output to GLB instead of GLTF. Alpha mode determines the interpretation of the alpha value of the main factor and texture. If opaque is selected, the alpha value is ignored and rendered output is fully opaque. If mask is selected, the rendered output will be fully opaque or fully transparent depending on the alpha value of the alpha cutoff value. If blend is selected, the alpha value is used to composite the source and destination areas, and the rendered output and the background are combined using the normal painting operation. This option uses a default value. Do note that you may need to experiment with the alpha mode settings to achieve the best results with the viewer you are using. The next setting is the PBR model. Here you can select if you want the PBR model to be specular glossiness or metallic roughness. That's all. Do remember that every third-party 3D software may read the files differently, thus you will need to utilize the appropriate settings compatible to the external software used. If you would like the recommended settings for Maya or Cinema 4D, you can refer to the available help website link. For more information, visit support.browseware.com.